I've been a member of the Lytton Phil for a decade now. It was the first institution of which I became a member when I came to live in the UK. So it's a real treat to be able to offer this talk, even via Zoom for the Lytton Phil. Do look forward to visiting again in person sometime soon. I'd like to begin my talk this evening with a picture of a blue plaque. The one I have in mind hangs above the Cafe Nero on Friargate in Preston in Lancashire. And as you can see here, the plaque commemorates Ben Franklin's visit to the town in 1775. Now, I've looked into this for a little bit, and I've not been able to find a record of that visit in Franklin's papers. And I do fear somewhat that the Preston and South Ribble Civic Trust may be mistaken in the date that they had imprinted on the plaque. But Franklin did stay in Preston at least a couple of times in the early 1770s, in 1771 and 1772. On both occasions, he was visiting the family of his son-in-law, Richard Bach. You can see here, I hope. Now, Bach was a Yorkshireman by birth. He was born in 1737 in Settle, where his father, William, worked as an excise officer. But the Bachs had moved to Preston by the mid-1740s. William Bach, again, Richard's father, died in Preston in 1747. Now, 13 years later, in 1760, 23-year-old Richard Bach, rather younger than in this portrait, he followed his brother, older brother, Theophylact. It's a name, isn't it? Theophylact Bach. Anyhow, Richard followed Theophylact over the pond to New York, where he set himself up as a dry goods grocer. But then in 1765, Richard decided to relocate from New York to Philadelphia, and he opened his own store in the city of brotherly love in 1766. And it was there the following year, in 1767, that Bach met Franklin's daughter, Ben Franklin's daughter, Sarah, or rather Sally. Hope you can see her here. Well, maybe not. Oh, there we go. There's Sally. Sally, as she was known to her family, named Sarah, but known as Sally. Now, all the while, Richard's mother and sisters were still living in Preston, and Richard eventually brought Sally over to England to meet his family in 1771. And it was that same year that Ben Franklin first stayed in Preston. He spent 2 days with the Bachs in Preston in November 1771, and then he paid them a return visit about 7 months later in the summer of 1772. Now that briefly explains that blue plaque, I think, and maybe briefly explains some of Franklin's Preston connections. But the bigger question, I suppose, is why was Franklin in Britain in the first place? And Franklin was a Philadelphian, of course. He'd been born in Boston, that's true. He was born in the province of Massachusetts in 1706, but he'd run away to Philly at the age of 17. And it was there in Philadelphia, that great city in eastern Pennsylvania, that he made his name as a printer, inventor, and scientist. And so it does seem fitting that Philadelphians, even today, think of themselves as living in Franklin City. In fact, though, Franklin only lived about 60% of his adult life in Philadelphia. He spent the other 40% living in Britain and in France. He lived in London between 1757 and 1762, and then again between 1764 and 1775. And then he lived in Paris between 1776 and 1785, so a significant portion of his life spent on this side of the Atlantic. Now, in all those cases, in London and in Paris, Franklin was working as a political representative. And so it might come as little surprise that his London lodgings were near Whitehall. You can actually still visit the house where he lived on Craven Street today. I hope it's now reopened like so many of our libraries and museums. The house is now the Benjamin Franklin House Museum, and it is really well worth visiting if you happen to find yourself in London someday. It's the only one of Franklin's former homes that survive, and yeah, again, really well worth a visit. Now, George Goodwin has written a fascinating book. Here's a copy. You hopefully see it on the slide as well. Goodwin's written a fascinating book about Franklin's life in London, which I highly recommend as well. There's a copy in the Lytton Phil's collection. Now, one thing that Goodwin stresses in his study of Franklin's London life is that London, in Franklin's day, was one of the world's great centers of scientific research. It was a place where learned groups like the Royal Society were shedding new light on the forces of nature, and Franklin fit right in with such natural philosophers, as scientists were commonly called in the 18th century. Franklin was already a distinguished researcher in his own right, after all. He attained international fame for his experiments and observations on electricity in the early 1750s. He performed his famous kite experiment in 1752, and he received the Copley Medal, the Royal Society's most prestigious award, for his work on electricity in 1753. 3 years later, in 1756, he had the honor of being elected a Fellow of the Society. Now, during his years in London, Franklin formed close friendships with a number of other natural philosophers, a number of other members and fellows of the Royal Society, including Sir John Pringle, who would actually go on to become the president of the Royal Society in 1772. What's more, while in London, Franklin also maintained a really wide circle of correspondence. Now, in all over the course of his life, Franklin sent to receive somewhere in the ballpark of 15,000 letters. And about 10% of those letters are written during the period when he was living in London. And his network of correspondence during those years was vast. As Carolyn Winter's research has revealed, Franklin's network stretched well beyond Britain and America. It included people in Europe, Scandinavia, and the West Indies. And transcriptions of many of Franklin's letters can be viewed online today as part of the Packard Humanities Institute's edition of Franklin's papers. And I've popped the URL for the Packard edition on the slide here. There you'll find online, a number of different letters written by Franklin or received by Franklin, including examples of Franklin's correspondence with notable figures in the history of the Northeast, figures such as John Cuthbert of Whitton Castle near Durham. Now, Cuthbert was also a Fellow of the Royal Society, and in 1773, he arranged for Thomas Bewick's drawing master, Ralph Bilby, to draw Franklin pictures of machinery being used in Newcastle's collieries. And Franklin shared some of Bilby's drawings with permission with his French correspondent, Jean-François Clement Moran, and Moran included some of those drawings by Bilby in the multi-volume study he produced in Paris between 1768 and 1779, exploring the art of coal extraction. So interesting to see pictures of Newcastle's collieries popping up in Paris in the 1770s. Now, in some cases, you'll actually find copies of original letters by Franklin in local records offices. This letter here, for instance, which appears courtesy of Carlisle Archive Center, courtesy of the Sen House papers in the Carlisle Archive Center, and particularly of courtesy of Joe Scott Plummer, shows Franklin exchanged letters with Major Humphrey Sen House of Netherhall in Cumberland in 1765. Sen House, the son of the Humphrey Sen House who founded the town of Maryport, on what's now the Cumbrian coast, Sen House wrote to Franklin on the 25th of January, 1765, explaining that he had suffered from increasing hearing loss after recovering from smallpox at the age of 15. And you can see the text of his letter transcribed on the left-hand side of this slide. You'll see that he wrote to Franklin saying that your very extraordinary discoveries and improvements in electricity have determined me, though an utter stranger to you, to take the liberty of asking whether you think any benefit might arise to me from the application of electrical machinery, or of the electrical machine, rather, in my unfortunate case. Sadly, though, as you can see here on the right, Franklin wasn't able to help him. He replied to Sen House sympathetically, "I wish I could give you any encouragement to hope relief in your case by means of electricity, but no instance of the kind has fallen within my knowledge. On the contrary, I've tried it on some patients, but without the least success." This is a minor but an illustrative incident in Franklin's correspondence, and it's interesting in that it reminds us of how keen people were, even in the mid-18th century, to explore the possible medical applications of electricity, to explore, I suppose, what we would now call electrotherapy. Now, it's fair to say that Franklin lived in London during a period when Anglo-American relations were a tad bit strained. Um, Britain's debts had soared during the Seven Years' War, and many colonists in America balked at the taxes imposed on them as a result. But Franklin's network of friends and associates provided him with support during those troubled times. Even so, his work as the colonial agent frequently landed him in hot water. In 1775, the Earl of Sandwich, the man immortalized by the finger food, publicly denounced Franklin as one of Britain's bitterest and most mischievous enemies. But throughout his time in London, Franklin was generally regarded less as a public enemy than as a loyal subject to King George III. Franklin was an Englishman, after all. His ancestors hailed from Northamptonshire. He himself had been born a British subject in Boston, and while in Paris in 1767, he even boasted that no Frenchman shall go beyond me in thinking my own king and queen the best, very best, rather, in the world. Now, in later years, Franklin did change his tune somewhat, but even when hostilities between Britain and its American colonies broke out, he worked to achieve a peaceful resolution. As late as 1774, in an anonymously published pamphlet on the causes of the present distractions in America, he steered a middle course. While he acknowledged that no reasonable man in England could approve of the seditious sentiments published in many American newspapers, he also expressed his regret that the decision of the British government, the decisions of Parliament, had needlessly driven so many American colonists out of their senses. Now, the equanimity Franklin demonstrated in such publications stayed with him through the upheavals of the American Revolution, and even after the war, he still held out hope that Britain and America would forge some kind of lasting alliance. In 1784, he actually went so far in a letter to his friend William Strahan, the publisher and MP, to suggest that Britain should dissolve its constitution and send members to the US Congress, to join up with the US. Now, Franklin joked to Strahan that idea smelled a bit of Madeira. I guess he was a bit worse for wear when he wrote that letter, but perhaps there's a sense of drunken sincerity in his words. Anyhow, now, what I want to emphasize here, though, is that Franklin was industrious during his time in London. He was by nature the sort of person who seemed to be able to find more hours in every day than most people can. But he also knew the value of taking time away from work, and he often used parliamentary recesses and other opportunities as a chance to get away. Franklin was rarely idle, though, even when he was on vacation. As Goodwin has observed in his book, these breaks were more like traveling sabbaticals and summer holidays. Franklin tended to use them to catch up on research and to visit remarkable places and remarkable people. Now, Franklin actually traveled to Europe 4 times during the 1760s when he was living in London. And during those visits, he stopped in Paris, he called it Versailles, and also took in the sites of several university cities in Holland, Flanders, and Germany. But he also made journeys to Edinburgh, the epicenter of the Scottish Enlightenment. Went there in the summer of 1759 when he also received an honorary doctorate of law from St. Andrews. And then again in the autumn of 1771, he paid a visit to Scotland, at that time actually traveling by way of the east of Ireland as well. Now, Franklin's tours in Ireland and Scotland were documented at length by J. Bennett Nolan back in getting my dates mixed up, back in 1956. And in Nolan's book, Ben Franklin in Scotland and Ireland, Nolan explains how these tours took Franklin through the north of England, and necessarily had to do so, at least in part, terrestrial transportation being required. For all that, though, Nolan says surprisingly little about the 2 separate tours that Franklin took of the Midlands and the north of England in the early 1770s. And I think oddly the same goes for Goodwin's book. Goodwin does mention Franklin's tours in passing, his tours on the continent, certainly his tours in Britain, which doesn't say a whole lot about them. His book is Ben Franklin in London, and I guess his interest is principally in exploring Franklin's London life. But the tours that Franklin took of the north of England in the early 1770s are well worth looking into. And that's kind of what I really want to do in the time that remains to me this evening. Now, the first of these two tours of the north of England, the Midlands and the north of England, I should say, took place in the spring of 1771, several months before the journey to Ireland and Scotland that you can see traced on this map from Nolan's book. Now, that May in 1771, Franklin spent 10 days traveling around the Midlands in the north with his grandnephew, Jonathan Williams Jr., and two friends, a man named John Canton and another man named Jan Ingelhaus. Now, as you can see on the map here, just to trace the route of that journey over a 18th century map, the path the four men followed took them to Leeds, it took them to Birmingham, it took them to Manchester. And near the latter town, interestingly, they traveled by canal boat into the Duke of Bridgewater's underground collieries. Franklin, unfortunately, didn't make a diary of his tour, but his grandnephew, Williams, did keep a journal. And in that journal, he describes their kind of visit to the collieries. He describes how they all embarked in a luxurious horse-drawn boat on the Duke of Bridgewater's canal and followed it to its end in the Duke's coal mines. The last 1,000 yards to the first coal face, he continues, were subterranean. And here they observed the miners at work in cramped quarters and watched the coal being brought out and loaded into a 40-ton canal boat, which a single horse then pulled to Manchester, where the canal again tunneled under a hill to a large hole running up to the surface through which a water-driven crane unloaded the coal. Now, interesting description of 18th century engineering, both canal works and mines, but this wouldn't be the last time that Franklin would find himself venturing into a coal mine. He actually did so on his second tour of the North in 1772. Now, on that occasion, in 1772, he was traveling with his friend Sir John Pringle, whom we met before. And as you can see here, again, plotted that journey, the two of them made their way northward via Northampton, an important connection with Franklin's ancestors, but then on to Birmingham and to Leeds, where they called on their mutual friend, the prestigious chemist and Royal Society fellow, Dr. Joseph Priestley. From Leeds, though, they then turned their steps to the northwest, to Cumberland and the Lake District, where they paid a visit to another Royal Society fellow, the physician and chemist William Brownrigg, who I'd like to tell you a little bit about. I think Brownrigg may not be a household name today. He's certainly not as well known as Franklin, Pringle, or Priestley, but he was one of the most ingenious and influential Northerners of the age. He was born at High Close Hall near Spatria in Cumberland in 1711, and he studied medicine in London and then in Leiden, where he obtained his MD in 1736. And on returning to England, I think interestingly, he chose to settle in Whitehaven, not so far from his place of birth, where he attended to the local community as a physician. He actually served communities sort of all the length of Cumberland, north to Carlisle, all the way south to Milham, but especially in Whitehaven, where he also conducted experiments to improve working conditions and safety in the town's coal mines. Now, Whitehaven was then one of the principal industrial settlements of the north. Thanks to the investments of Sir John Lowther and his son, Sir James Lowther, the town had risen from a small fishing village to become the second most productive center for coal mining in the country, after Newcastle, of course, second most after Newcastle. And Whitehaven's undersea mine, the Saltham Pit, which opened in 1729, was widely regarded as one of the wonders of the age. Now, during his time in Whitehaven, Brownrigg acted as Sir James Lowther's personal physician. And in 1743, Sir James gave him money to build a laboratory to explore the management of explosive mine gases, including methane or fire damp. And with Lowther's support, moreover, Brownrigg went on to publish 5 papers on fire damp in the Royal Society's Philosophical Transactions. And among other things, those papers explain how taking measurements of barometric pressure can help to prevent, or at least to predict, explosions underground. But by the time Brownrigg retired, he settled at Ormithwaite Hall near Keswick, so inland from the coast in what we guess now know as the Lake District. And it was there, living in retirement, that he pursued further research into, again, gases, but also salts and mineral springs, earned him a considerable reputation. He was eventually made, as I mentioned, he was made a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1742, and went on through his work at Ormithwaite to receive the Copley Medal for a study of the properties of spa water in 1766. Now, it was John Pringle who arranged Franklin's visit to Brownrigg in 1772. Pringle was, of course, very well networked within the Royal Society, and he wrote to Brownrigg that June to inform him that Franklin and he were headed to Leeds. Franklin and Brownrigg leapt at the opportunity. He invited both men to carry on from Leeds, carry on from visiting Joseph Priestley, to come and be his guests at Ormithwaite Hall. Now, Franklin and Pringle stayed with Brownrigg between late June and early July. The dates aren't entirely clear, but the time they did spend together, the three men busied themselves exploring the region around Keswick, Cumberland, from top to bottom. They ascended to the summits of some of the local mountains, possibly even Skiddaw, and they plumbed the depths of Whitehaven's undersea mines. Franklin was evidently wowed by these adventures. He wrote home to his wife Deborah in Philadelphia, exclaiming that I've been nearer both the upper and lower regions of the earth than ever in my life before. But it's more than just a shared interest in mine shafts and mountains that brought Franklin and Brownrigg together. At the time, after all, both men were also researching the physical properties of fluids. Of course, early research into electricity conceives of electricity as a fluid, but they also had other kinds of shared interests. And these shared interests inspired Franklin to attempt an innovative and somewhat curious experiment using oil to still the surface of Derwentwater, the large lake near Keswick. Now, people have long known that oil can be used to calm the surface of water. Pliny the Elder, the Roman statesman and scholar, noted that phenomenon in the 1st century. And the great church historian of the North, the Venerable Bede, actually draws attention to that property of oil in the 700s. But even a millennium after Bede, the cause of this curious property of oil was still not entirely understood. Now, Franklin's interest in the matter was aroused on his way to England in 1757. He was traveling in a fleet of ships, and he noticed that the wake of two of the ships in front of the one that he was on appeared much calmer than the others. And Franklin drew the captain of his ship's attention to what he saw, asking the captain why this was the case. He was advised that the cooks in those ships had probably just tipped out the greasy water from their pots that had made the sides of both the vessels slick. Franklin, for good reasons, wasn't entirely satisfied with that explanation, and so he set out to study the phenomenon for himself. He was particularly keen to determine why oil should spread when you drop it in water, but not when you drop it onto other smooth surfaces, such as a glass or polished stone. He was also eager to determine whether pouring out oil could help ships make their way shoreward through rough seas. Now, he began to speculate about that later issue on his voyage back to Philadelphia, back from England in 1762, when he observed that the oil in his lamp floated smoothly, even though the water underneath it was in great commotion, because a lamp at sea, sensible to have that water there under the oil. There's a safety precaution, but here Franklin taking notice of the fact that even though the water was swirling around underneath with the rocking of the ship, the oil on the top remained smooth and steady. And he drew his fellow passengers' attention to this in his cabin, and one of them mentioned that he was aware that Portuguese and Bermudan fishermen were often also accustomed at times to pour oil over choppy water to smooth their voyage into harbor. With all of this in mind, Franklin devised an experiment that he first seems to have attempted on the large pond on Clapham Common. On that occasion, he was astounded to observe, and this is recorded, how not more than a teaspoonful of oil produced an instant calm that spread over half an acre of the water. Now, I think it's important to add that Franklin wasn't using petroleum. He was more likely using olive oil or possibly lamp oil, latter of which was then commonly derived from, among other things, whales. Leaving the vexed issue of whaling to one side, I think the fact that Franklin wasn't pouring crude oil into Britain's waterways is worth noting and somewhat reassuring. Still, for all that, I expect the good people of Clapham would prefer us not to dump liquid fat into their ponds these days. In any case, Franklin's investigations on Clapham Common allowed him to observe the behavior of oil spreading and calming a small body of water. His trip to Keswick during his northern tour of 1772 presented the ideal opportunity to test the experiment on a proper lake and in the company of one of the nation's most distinguished chemists, Dr. Brownrigg. So one afternoon, during his visit, Franklin, Brownrigg, and Pringle all rowed out onto Derwent Water and tested the experiment. The lake, we're told, was in a great agitation at the time, but was instantly calmed to a great distance about the boat at the application of only a very small quantity of oil. The three men were no doubt pleased with this outcome, but they could only conjecture about the cause of the spectacle that they had witnessed. Now, the world would little know of this event were it not for the Reverend James Farish of Carlisle. He caught wind of the three men's doings, and he begged Brownrigg to provide him with a detailed account of what he had called the Keswick experiment. At Brownrigg's request, Franklin then wrote a letter explaining the experiment that was subsequently published as an article in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society in 1774. And the copy of that publication you see here comes from the Lytton-Phil's collections. Perhaps well worth looking up sometime. Frustratingly, though, this letter provides little specific information about the Keswick experiment and what had happened on Derwent Water. It mainly focuses on the history of Franklin's interest in oil, but also mentions his experiments on Clapham Common before proceeding to discuss another experiment he conducted at Portsmouth. It also draws attention to some of the early observations made about the properties of oil and what might cause oil to smooth water, going all the way back to Pliny. But Franklin's letter, as published in this article, was like many of his published works. It was intelligent, but also accessible. And it was soon reprinted as a pamphlet that helped to reach an even wider audience. And you can see a picture of that pamphlet here. This pamphlet, or perhaps the Royal Society article, evidently came to the attention of James Boswell, Dr. Johnson's biographer. And Boswell drolly drew a connection between Franklin's experiments and the current political climate. Writing to the American diplomat William Temple in 1775, Boswell observed that Franklin has written upon stilling the waves of the ocean by oil, as I see you would quiet the turbulent Americans by lenient measures. Now, Franklin repeated his oil on water experiment on at least 3 further occasions. The results in each case were inconclusive. But these tests did help Franklin to form a theory that went on to make waves of its own. His ideas about the interaction of oil and water helped pave the way for the modern study of intermolecular forces and fluid mechanics. And since the publication of Franklin's letter, the expression to pour oil on troubled waters has become an even more common figure of speech. Some of Franklin's biographers have pointed out that that doesn't seem only coincidental. Franklin was working as a colonial agent in the period. He was working to calm a turbulent political situation. And it's certainly tempting to think that something of his experiments and his political work live on in our everyday conversations. Be that as it may, Franklin's experiments, I think, is important to remember for other reasons as well, alongside the journeys to the north that allowed him to conduct that experiment on Derwent Water. It reminds us, I suppose, of the transatlantic connections that define the early modern history of northern England. It reminds us, I suppose, in the case of the Derwent Water experiment, that some of the people who went to the Lake District or places like the Lake District in the 1700s weren't drawn there simply by promises of picturesque landscapes. They came to see man-made wonders, such as the mines of Whitehaven. They came because of the presence of eminent scientists like Dr. Brownrigg. And when viewed in that light, I think Franklin's English tours of 1771 and 1772 seem like much more than a curious episode in the history of the North. Rather, they might seem to stand forth as a reminder of the region's transatlantic and global links, but also as a reminder of its long-standing reputation as a place of exploration, experimentation, and discovery. Thank you for listening. be glad to take any questions that you might have or might have punched into the chat. So I'll stop sharing my screen now. We can have a bit of a conversation.
Chris, why do you think he concentrated more on the west of England rather than further east to Newcastle, for example?
No, indeed. Digging into the topic, I was hoping to find more about his northeastern connections. I can't say for certain because it's very clear that his correspondence network linked him in communication with a number of people in the northeast. He did pass through Newcastle, but only passed through on his return from Scotland in 1759, but left no account of what he saw there at the time. I mean, the most substantial connection I could trace, though, were those drawings by Bilby, which Franklin then passed on to Moraunt in the 1770s. But it is curious that his journeys as a tourist around the north of England really only take him to Leeds, but no further northeasterly.
Thank you. We have a question from June Watson. Have you come across any references to the Shipley family in the letters?
Yes, definitely. That's definitely the case. But I haven't explored those connections myself very extensively. But I do believe, if I'm not mistaken, that there are significant connections with the Shipley family. It'd be well worth looking into. Is that the subject about which you happen to know a bit?
Yeah, I've done some research on the Shipley family, and they were well connected with Benjamin, and he stayed at their house, and they were connected to the Duke and Duchess of Cavendish, the Cavendishes, and he was very good at teaching women about science. And Anna Maria Shipley, who I researched, there are a lot of letters at Yale, and they describe how all the Shipley sisters were fascinated by his work, and they looked after him in London and at their home. And the Shipley father was the Bishop of St. Asaph, and he was very influential in government, in the Royal Society. And so what I found was he was very, very good at encouraging women in science. And it was something that hasn't sort of appeared. And Anna Maria Shipley, she was married to Sir William Jones, the Orientalist.
No, that's, I think, really important points, and thank you for that. It's evident that there's certain aspects of Franklin's English life that I need to explore in more detail, but that is an outstanding point. His commitments and interests in educating young women in natural science. I suppose similar connections could be drawn with the daughter of his landlady on Craven Street. Mary Stevenson, I guess, becomes Mary Hewson, with whom he carried on an extensive correspondence, answering and kind of conducting not only, I guess, a kind of one-way conversation, but it seemed to be mutually informative, her stimulating his interest and his own kind of desire to pursue research, and he in the process having the opportunity to act the part of the pedagogue.
Yes, he talks to the Bishop of St. Asaph quite a lot about how clever the girls were. And Benjamin said, you know, you must encourage them. And they wrote to him in America as well. And they sent him loving letters. They asked for his portrait. They idolized him. It was quite fascinating.
He seems to have been a very charismatic figure. And I think, as you said, the correspondence is such a rich resource for understanding his movements and his relationships. A pity that he didn't leave a more extensive journal or diary for us. But I guess it's been pointed out that he was possibly too busy to making history to record it, at least constantly.
Well, the thing is, a lot of these women, once they married, they were just known by their husband's name.
Indeed.
And their stories are forgotten.
Indeed. No, that's a very good point.
Thank you.
Chris, Lorna asks, is there any mention of meeting with any of the other lunar men apart from Priestley?
Indeed there are. And now it's gone right out of my head, but there's certainly significant connections around the West Midlands. And certainly Franklin was familiar with Erasmus Darwin, I believe. And he certainly would have been, through his correspondence in connection with other members of the Lunar Society. And I think that's the interesting aspect of his tours, I suppose, is that sense that he did visit places in person, but connected and continued his relationships extensively through writing. But thank you so much for listening, and thank you for those points, both about the Shipley family and the Lunar Society. As I said, this is a kind of, this is research I'm sort of entering into myself at the moment. And so really great to have those as important points of reference, and certainly do very strongly take June's point that very important to attend to the way in which the history of Franklin's career intersects significantly with the history of women in science in the Enlightenment.
Well, Chris, thank you. I'd like to thank you on behalf of the audience and to thank you on behalf of the Lytton Phil. It's much appreciated. It was a really engaging, detailed and fascinating talk, really. And I, for one, will be going back into the Lytton Phil quite soon to search out some of the books that you've just referred to. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and good night.
Thank you.